The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Maya shifted carefully in the hospital bed, every movement sending sharp reminders of the 18 hours of labor that had finally brought her daughter into the world. Little Emma slept peacefully in her arms, tiny fingers curled around Maya's thumb with a grip that felt stronger than steel. The emergency cesarean had left Maya exhausted and tender, but she had never felt more complete. I wonder how many of you watching from your own homes, maybe in California or Texas or wherever you're tuning in from, have experienced that magical first moment holding your newborn. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and if you remember that overwhelming feeling of love mixed with pure exhaustion. David should have been here. Her husband had promised to return after his quick meeting at the Sterling family law firm, but that was 6 hours ago. Maya glanced at her phone for the dozenth time, seeing no missed calls or messages. She told herself he was probably handling some urgent case, but a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts she tried to silence. The private room Maya had quietly arranged for herself was spacious and comfortable, with soft lighting and a view of the city skyline. Most people assumed David's family had paid for the luxury accommodations, never questioning how a supposedly struggling graduate student could afford such things. Maya pulled her sleeve down slightly, covering the vintage Cartier watch her grandmother had given her years ago. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Maya expected to see David's familiar face, but instead, Margaret and Richard Sterling stepped through the doorway. Her in-laws wore expressions of concern that somehow felt more like masks than genuine emotion. Margaret Sterling approached the bed with measured steps, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her manicured hands. She was a woman who commanded attention wherever she went, silver hair perfectly styled, and clothing that whispered expensive rather than shouted it. Richard followed behind her, tall and imposing in his tailored suit, every inch the successful attorney who had built the Sterling family fortune. "Good evening, Maya," Margaret said, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy people used when they wanted to sound caring but maintained emotional distance. "How are you feeling, dear?" Maya shifted Emma slightly, protective instincts already sharpening. "I'm tired but happy. Where's David? I thought he would be back by now." Richard exchanged a glance with his wife, and Maya caught something in that look that made her stomach clench. "That's actually why we're here," he said, removing a manila envelope from his briefcase. "There are some matters we need to discuss." The way he said matters made Maya's blood run cold. She had been around enough powerful people in her life to recognize the tone of someone delivering bad news they had already decided was inevitable. Margaret moved closer to the bed, her expression shifting from fake sympathy to something harder. "Maya, dear," Margaret began, settling into the visitor's chair with deliberate slowness. "David has been doing some serious thinking about his future, about what he really wants from life." The words hit Maya like physical blows. She looked down at Emma, sleeping so peacefully, completely unaware that her world was about to shatter. "What exactly are you saying?" Richard stepped forward, his lawyer instincts taking over. "What my wife is trying to explain is that David feels trapped. The pregnancy, the marriage, the responsibilities. He's a young man with tremendous potential, and he believes this situation is preventing him from achieving what he's capable of." "Situation." Maya repeated the word slowly, letting its coldness sink in. "You mean his daughter? His family?" Margaret's mask slipped slightly, revealing something uglier underneath. "Let's be honest about what this really is, shall we? You're a smart girl, Maya. You must have known that someone like David would eventually realize he could do better than a foreign exchange student with no real prospects." The casual cruelty in Margaret's voice was breathtaking. Maya had endured subtle racism and classism throughout her relationship with David, but she had never experienced anything quite this direct. She clutched Emma closer, feeling her daughter's tiny heartbeat against her chest. Richard opened the manila envelope and withdrew a thick stack of legal documents. "David has asked us to handle this matter for him, given the delicate timing. These are divorce papers, already prepared and filed. All you need to do is sign." Maya stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. "You want me to sign divorce papers while I'm still connected to and for? While I'm holding our newborn daughter? We understand this is difficult timing," Richard continued in his professional voice. "But David felt it would be better to address this quickly rather than drag things out. He's prepared to offer a modest settlement, considering the brief duration of the marriage and the circumstances. The circumstances being that I just gave birth to his child. Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a compassionate whisper. Maya, dear, you have to understand David's position. He married you in a moment of infatuation, but now he sees clearly. You trapped him with this pregnancy. He has a brilliant future ahead of him at our firm, and he can't be tied down by youthful mistakes. Each word felt like a carefully aimed dagger. Maya had known Margaret never approved of her, but she had never imagined such calculated cruelty was possible. She looked down at Emma, this perfect little person who was apparently being dismissed as a youthful mistake. What about Emma? Maya asked quietly. What about your granddaughter? Richard's expression remained impassive. David is willing to provide minimal child support as required by law. Naturally, custody arrangements can be discussed through proper legal channels. Minimal child support. Maya felt something cold and hard settling in her chest. She glanced at the legal documents, recognizing the letterhead from one of the most expensive law firms in the city. The Sterling family had come prepared for battle, armed with legal expertise and unlimited resources. You don't have much choice in this matter, Margaret said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Fighting this will only make things more expensive and painful for everyone involved. David has access to the best legal representation money can buy. What do you have? A part-time job and student loans. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she looked at the divorce papers. The settlement offer was insultingly small, barely enough to cover basic expenses for a few months. The custody arrangement suggested minimal visitation rights for David, as if Emma was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a daughter to be cherished. She thought about the phone calls she could make, the resources she could access with a single text message. But something held her back. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was a deeper instinct that told her to wait, to watch, to document exactly what kind of people she was dealing with. I need a pen, Maya said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's smile was triumphant as she handed over an expensive fountain pen. You're making the smart choice, dear. This way, everyone can move forward with their lives. Maya signed her name on the designated lines, her hand shaking with emotion that her in-laws mistook for fear and defeat. Richard collected the papers with the satisfaction of a man who had just won an easy victory. There's one more thing, Margaret said, standing to leave. We'll be expecting you to move out of the apartment by the end of the month. The lease is in David's name, of course. Of course, Maya echoed, her voice hollow. And Maya, Richard added from the doorway. We trust you'll be discreet about this matter. The Sterling family values its reputation, and we wouldn't want any unpleasant publicity. After they left, Maya sat in the quiet hospital room, holding Emma close and listening to the soft sounds of her breathing. She reached for her phone with her free hand and scrolled through her contacts until she found a number she hadn't called in months. The conversation was brief and conducted entirely in Mandarin. When it ended, Maya set the phone aside and looked down at her daughter. They think they've won, sweetheart, she whispered to Emma. They think mommy is just a poor little foreign girl with no power and no options. They have no idea what they've just started. Maya pulled her sleeve up slightly, revealing the Cartier watch that had been her grandmother's. On the nightstand beside her bed sat a designer diaper bag that Margaret had assumed was a cheap knockoff. Hidden beneath seemingly modest belongings were signs of a life the Sterling family had never bothered to investigate. Tomorrow, Maya would begin documenting everything. Every interaction, every cruel word, every assumption they made about her powerlessness. She would build a case so thorough and devastating that when the time came for justice, it would be swift and absolute. But tonight, she simply held her daughter and planned. 6 weeks had passed since that devastating night in the hospital, and Maya had settled into a rhythm of motherhood in the modest 2-bedroom apartment she had quietly secured across town. Emma was thriving, growing stronger each day, and Maya found herself marveling at how much joy such a tiny person could bring even in the darkest circumstances. The apartment was deliberately unremarkable, furnished with pieces that looked like they came from discount stores but were actually carefully chosen for their understated quality. Maya had learned long ago that true wealth often hid behind humble appearances, and she needed the Sterling family to continue underestimating her capabilities. The knock on her door came early on a Saturday morning, aggressive and impatient. Maya peered through the peephole and felt her stomach drop. David stood in the hallway with two men she didn't recognize, and behind them loomed a moving truck. Maya opened the door slowly, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms. David looked uncomfortable, unable to meet her eyes directly, while the moving men waited with obvious impatience. "Hello, David," Maya said quietly. "I wasn't expecting you." "We're here for my things," David replied, his voice carrying a defensive edge she had never heard before. "The furniture, the electronics, half of everything we bought together." Before Maya could respond, Margaret Sterling's voice echoed from the stairwell. "Is this really where you've been living, Maya? How depressing." Margaret emerged into view wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She surveyed the modest hallway with obvious distaste, as if the very air might contaminate her designer clothing. "We're just here to collect what belongs to David," Margaret announced, pushing past Maya into the apartment. "The boys can get started right away." Maya stepped aside, knowing that resistance would only escalate the confrontation while Emma was in her arms. She watched as the moving men began examining her belongings with the casual indifference of people accustomed to dismantling other people's lives. Richard Sterling appeared in the doorway, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of someone conducting unpleasant but necessary business. "Maya, we have a list of items that David purchased during your marriage. I trust you won't make this more difficult than it needs to be." The list was extensive and clearly designed to leave Maya with as little as possible. The sofa David had insisted on buying, claiming it was for their future together. The large television they had supposedly picked out together, though Maya remembered David making all the actual decisions. Even kitchen appliances that Maya had paid for herself but couldn't prove without receipts she had deliberately not kept. "This coffee machine is quite expensive," Margaret observed, running her finger along the sleek Italian espresso maker. "Surely too extravagant for someone in your current circumstances." Maya bit back the response that the machine was a gift from her college roommate, who happened to be the daughter of a coffee magnate. Instead, she simply nodded as one of the moving men carefully wrapped it for transport. Emma began to fuss slightly, and Maya instinctively reached for a bottle from the well-stocked diaper bag beside her chair. Margaret's eyes immediately focused on the formula container, and her expression shifted to one of barely concealed disgust. "Formula feeding already," Margaret commented with the tone of someone pointing out a moral failing. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. David mentioned you weren't really the nurturing type." The formula was actually an organic, European brand that cost 4 times more than standard options, carefully chosen for its superior nutrition profile. Maya had researched extensively before selecting it, consulting with pediatric nutritionists and reading studies most parents never knew existed. But she simply prepared Emma's bottle without explanation. Richard had moved to Maya's small desk and was examining the papers scattered across its surface. "Harvard Business School," he read aloud from a letter. "Maya, you never mentioned you had an MBA." "It never came up," Maya replied calmly, though she noticed David's surprised expression. Apparently, her husband had never bothered to ask about her educational background beyond her current graduate studies. Margaret snatched the letter from Richard's hands, scanning it quickly. "Diversity admission, no doubt," she said dismissively. "These programs are always looking for foreign students to boost their international numbers." Maya felt a familiar sting at the casual racism, but she had learned to document these moments rather than respond to them. Her phone sat nearby, recording everything as it had for weeks. Every cruel comment, every assumption, every revelation of their true character was being carefully preserved. The moving men had reached Maya's bedroom, and she could hear them discussing which items to take. David emerged looking uncomfortable, carrying a framed photo of their wedding day. "You can keep this," he said awkwardly, setting the photo on the kitchen counter. "I know it probably means something to you." "How generous," Maya replied softly, noting how David couldn't quite meet her eyes. Margaret was now going through Maya's mail with brazen curiosity, sorting through bills and correspondence as if she had every right to examine Maya's private affairs. She paused at several letters written in Chinese characters, holding them up with obvious suspicion. "What are these?" Margaret demanded. "Some kind of legal documents." "Letters from my family," Maya answered truthfully. "They like to know how Emma is doing." Margaret's expression suggested she suspected some kind of deception, but she couldn't read the elegant Chinese script well enough to pursue the matter. She had no way of knowing that the letters contained updates on multimillion-dollar business deals and investment strategies that Maya had been quietly managing from her modest apartment. Richard had found Maya's laptop bag and was examining it with professional interest. "This is quite sophisticated equipment for a graduate student," he observed. "The encryption software alone must have cost thousands." Maya shrugged casually. "I do a lot of research. Data security is important." What she didn't mention was that the laptop contained files worth hundreds of millions of dollars, protected by security protocols that would make government agencies envious. The Sterling family was literally handling billions of dollars in assets while dismissing her as financially irrelevant. David emerged from the bedroom carrying several suits that Maya had encouraged him to buy for job interviews. She remembered shopping with him, quietly steering him toward quality pieces that would last for years. Now he packed them away as if they represented a chapter of his life he was eager to forget. One of the moving men asked about a piece of furniture that wasn't on the official list, and David hesitated. Margaret immediately intervened, insisting that anything of value obviously belonged to her son. Maya watched her belongings disappear piece by piece, mentally calculating the cost of replacing everything while knowing she could afford to buy 10 times more without making a meaningful dent in her resources. The process took 3 hours, during which Margaret made a steady stream of observations about Maya's lifestyle, David's bright future, and the general inappropriateness of their entire situation. She criticized everything from Maya's choice of baby clothes to her decision to live in such a modest neighborhood. At one point, Maya's phone rang, and she answered in Mandarin, speaking quickly and quietly while Emma napped in her arms. The conversation was brief but intense, covering quarterly reports and acquisition opportunities that would have made Richard Sterling's legal career look like pocket change. When she hung up, Margaret was staring at her with obvious suspicion. "That sounded like business talk," Margaret said accusingly. "What kind of business could you possibly be involved in?" "Family matters," Maya replied calmly. "Nothing that would interest you." The final insult came as the moving men were loading the last items onto their truck. David approached Maya with an envelope, his expression a mixture of guilt and entitlement. "This is a bill for half the moving costs," he explained awkwardly. "Since we're splitting everything fairly, I figured you should pay your share of getting it sorted out." Maya looked at the bill, noting that the moving company was one of the most expensive in the city. David had chosen premium service to dismantle their life together and expected her to pay for the privilege. "Of course," Maya said quietly, making a note to add this moment to her growing documentation file. As the Sterling family prepared to leave, Margaret delivered one final commentary on Maya's situation. "You know, dear, this might actually be the best thing for you. Now you can find someone more appropriate to your actual circumstances. Someone who won't expect you to live beyond your means." Maya nodded politely, cradling Emma close as she watched them drive away with most of her visible possessions. The apartment felt empty and cold, stripped of the comfortable life she had carefully constructed. But Maya wasn't thinking about furniture or electronics. She was thinking about justice, about consequences, and about the detailed records she had been compiling since the night Emma was born. The Sterling family had just provided her with hours of additional evidence, documenting their cruelty and prejudice with their own words and actions. She reached for her phone and made another call, this time to a law firm that the Sterlings had never heard of but would soon learn to respect. The conversation was brief and conducted in flawless English, arranging a meeting for the following Monday. As Maya hung up, Emma stirred in her arms and opened her dark eyes, gazing up at her mother with the complete trust that only babies possess. Maya smiled down at her daughter, feeling a fierce protectiveness that went far beyond mere maternal instinct. "They think they've broken us, sweetheart," Maya whispered. "They think they've taken everything that matters. But they have no idea what's coming for them." The family courthouse felt deliberately intimidating, with its high ceilings, marble floors, and the kind of institutional coldness that reminded everyone who entered that they were at the mercy of a system much larger than their personal problems. Maya sat quietly on a wooden bench outside courtroom 7, Emma sleeping peacefully in her carrier, apparently unbothered by the gravity of the situation that would determine her future. Maya wore a simple navy dress that she had purchased from a department store, the kind of outfit that suggested respectability without drawing attention. Her hair was pulled back in a modest ponytail, and she carried only a single manila folder containing what appeared to be basic legal documents. To anyone observing, she looked exactly like what the Sterling family believed her to be, a struggling single mother facing overwhelming odds. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic when the Sterling family arrived. David walked between his parents like a man being escorted to his own execution, clearly uncomfortable but committed to the path they had chosen for him. Richard Sterling commanded attention even in a courthouse full of lawyers, his custom-tailored suit and confident bearing marking him as someone accustomed to getting his way. Margaret followed close behind, surveying the modest surroundings with obvious distaste. Behind them came their legal team, four attorneys from Whitfield, Morrison and Associates, one of the most prestigious family law firms in the state. They moved with the coordinated precision of people who had dismantled countless families and divided countless fortunes, carrying briefcases that probably cost more than most people made in a month. James Morrison himself led the team, a silver-haired patriarch whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had made him the go-to attorney for wealthy families seeking to protect their interests. He had personally handled divorces involving senators, business moguls, and entertainment celebrities, always ensuring that his clients emerged victorious regardless of the human cost. Maya watched their arrival with apparent nervousness, clutching her simple folder and glancing around as if looking for help that wasn't coming. She had deliberately arrived early and positioned herself where the Sterling family would see her apparent isolation and vulnerability. The courtroom deputy called their case, and everyone filed inside. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided, a woman in her 50s with a reputation for fairness but also for impatience with legal theatrics. She had seen enough custody battles to recognize the pattern developing before her: wealthy family versus struggling mother, expensive lawyers versus whatever minimal representation the court could provide. Your Honor, Morrison began with the practiced confidence of someone arguing before a predetermined conclusion. We represent David Sterling in this matter of custody and asset division. My client seeks full custody of the minor child and appropriate division of marital assets. Maya remained seated at the defendant's table, apparently waiting for some kind of legal assistance that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. The court-appointed advocate assigned to her case was Maria Santos, a dedicated but overworked public defender who was clearly outmatched by the Sterling legal machine. Judge Hendricks looked at Maya with what appeared to be sympathy. Ms. Chun, do you have legal representation? Maya stood slowly, still holding Emma, and spoke in a voice barely loud enough to reach the bench. Your Honor, I have someone coming, but they seem to be running late. May I request a brief postponement? The request sounded desperate, exactly as Maya intended. Morrison exchanged a confident glance with Richard Sterling, clearly pleased by the apparent disorganization of their opposition. Your Honor, Morrison interjected smoothly. My client has taken time from his busy schedule to resolve this matter today. We respectfully request that proceedings continue as scheduled. Judge Hendricks checked her watch and nodded reluctantly. We'll proceed with opening statements. Ms. Santos, you may represent Ms. Chun for now. Maria Santos stood with visible reluctance, carrying a thin file that looked pathetic compared to the Sterling team's extensive documentation. Your Honor, my client simply seeks fair treatment in this matter. She is a devoted mother who wants what's best for her daughter. Morrison's response was immediate and devastating. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Ms. Chun deliberately trapped my client in this marriage through pregnancy. She has no significant assets, no stable employment, and no realistic means of providing for a child. Mr. Sterling, meanwhile, comes from a family of distinguished attorneys with unlimited resources to ensure this child receives the best possible care. Maya appeared to flinch at each accusation, though internally, she was taking careful notes of every claim Morrison made. Each statement would become evidence in a case Morrison couldn't yet imagine was being built against his clients. The Sterling lawyer continued his opening with brutal efficiency. Ms. Chun is a foreign national with questionable immigration status, Your Honor. She has no meaningful family connections in this country and no substantial community ties. Granting her custody would essentially allow her to disappear with this child, potentially taking her to another country where Mr. Sterling would have no legal recourse. The immigration attack was particularly vicious, designed to paint Maya as both unstable and potentially dangerous. Morrison had clearly researched enough to know Maya was here on a valid student visa, but he was betting that the court wouldn't investigate deeply enough to understand her actual legal status. Maya stood again, this time with Emma beginning to stir in her arms. "Your Honor, I am here legally, and I have no intention of leaving the country. I only want to provide a stable home for my daughter." Her voice carried just the right note of pleading desperation, though she was actually calculating the precise moment when Morrison's confidence would be most dramatically shattered. Judge Hendricks appeared moved by Maya's apparent vulnerability. "Mr. Morrison, what specific custody arrangement is your client seeking?" "Full custody, Your Honor," Morrison replied without hesitation. Ms. Chun may have supervised visitation rights, naturally, but given her financial instability and lack of family support, she simply cannot provide the kind of environment this child deserves. Margaret Sterling nodded approvingly from the gallery, clearly satisfied with how thoroughly Maya was being dismantled. David looked increasingly uncomfortable, but he remained silent as his family's lawyers systematically destroyed the woman he had once claimed to love. Maria Santos tried to mount a defense, arguing that Maya had been a devoted mother and that separating a nursing infant from her mother would be traumatic for the child. But her arguments sounded weak against Morrison's carefully constructed narrative of financial inadequacy and cultural instability. The hearing was interrupted when Maya's phone buzzed quietly. She glanced at it and appeared to receive some kind of message that made her straighten slightly in her chair. Judge Hendricks noticed the subtle change, but said nothing. Morrison was now presenting financial documents that painted Maya as completely dependent on David's family for support. The Sterling legal team had obviously done extensive research, uncovering her student status, her modest living situation, and her apparent lack of significant income. "Your Honor," Morrison continued, "Ms. Chun has been living essentially as a dependent since her marriage to my client. She has no career prospects, no substantial savings, and no realistic plan for supporting herself and a child. Meanwhile, Mr. Sterling is prepared to establish a generous trust fund for his daughter's education and future security." The offer sounded incredibly generous until Maya realized that David's trust fund would be controlled entirely by the Sterling family, giving them leverage over Emma for the rest of her life. Every decision about education, healthcare, and even where Emma could live would ultimately be subject to Sterling approval. Maya appeared to be growing more distressed as Morrison systematically demolished her position, but she was actually admiring the thoroughness of his preparation. The Sterling family had obviously spent considerable resources investigating her background, and they had been remarkably successful at uncovering her carefully constructed facade. What they hadn't discovered was anything real. Just as Morrison was reaching the climax of his opening statement, emphasizing Maya's complete unsuitability as a custodial parent, there was a commotion at the back of the courtroom. Maya turned to look, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself a small smile. The courtroom doors opened, and a man in an immaculate charcoal suit entered with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to changing the trajectory of legal proceedings. He was tall, distinguished, and carried himself with the kind of authority that made even experienced lawyers take notice. "Your Honor," the newcomer said in a voice that carried easily through the courtroom, "I apologize for my tardiness. Harrison Wells of Wells, Patterson and Associates, representing Ms. Chun." Morrison's confident expression faltered slightly. Wells, Patterson and Associates was one of the most prestigious firms in the country, specializing in high-stakes litigation for clients whose names appeared regularly in financial newspapers. Harrison Wells himself was a legend in legal circles, known for taking cases that seemed impossible and somehow finding ways to win them. Judge Hendricks looked surprised, but pleased. "Mr. Wells, you're certainly welcome. Are you prepared to proceed?" Wells approached Maya's table and set down a briefcase that looked like it cost more than Morrison's car. "Yes, Your Honor. Though I believe my client may have some additional documentation to file before we continue." Maya reached into her simple manila folder and withdrew a sealed envelope that she handed to the court clerk. The clerk examined it and passed it to Judge Hendricks, who opened it with growing interest. The judge's expression changed dramatically as she read the contents. "Mr. Wells, this appears to be a motion for discovery and financial disclosure. Are you suggesting that previous filings in this matter have been incomplete?" Wells smiled with the satisfaction of someone about to reveal a carefully laid trap. "Your Honor, I believe my client has been somewhat modest about her actual circumstances. With the court's permission, we would like to present a more complete picture of her financial situation." Morrison looked genuinely confused, clearly wondering how a struggling single mother had managed to retain one of the most expensive lawyers in the country. Richard Sterling's confident expression was beginning to show cracks, as if he was starting to realize that something fundamental about this situation had escaped his attention. Maya looked up at Wells with apparent relief and gratitude, playing her role perfectly. The Sterling family still believed they were watching a desperate woman receiving unexpected legal charity. They had no idea they were about to witness the first phase of their own systematic destruction. The second hearing convened exactly 2 weeks later, and the Sterling family arrived with even greater confidence than before. Morrison had spent the intervening time preparing what he assumed would be a routine demolition of whatever desperate legal maneuvers Maya's surprise attorney might attempt. Richard Sterling walked into the courthouse like a man attending his own coronation, while Margaret practically radiated satisfaction at the prospect of finally removing Maya from their lives permanently. David followed behind his parents, looking increasingly hollow with each passing day. The divorce proceedings had drained something essential from him. Whether it was guilt or simply the realization that he was allowing his family to destroy the mother of his child remained unclear. He avoided looking toward Maya's side of the courtroom entirely. Maya sat in the same position as before, wearing another modest dress and holding Emma with the same quiet desperation that had marked her previous appearance. Harrison Wells sat beside her, but even his presence seemed insufficient against the overwhelming resources arrayed against them. The Sterling legal team had expanded to include 2 additional associates and a private investigator whose job was presumably to uncover any remaining secrets about Maya's background. Judge Hendricks called the court to order and looked expectantly at Wells. "Mr. Wells, you filed several motions since our last hearing. Are you prepared to proceed?" Wells stood with unhurried grace, adjusting his cufflinks in a gesture that somehow managed to convey both respect for the court and absolute confidence in his position. "Your Honor, we are indeed prepared. However, I believe it would be appropriate for my client to address certain misrepresentations that were made during opposing counsel's opening statement." Morrison rose immediately. "Your Honor, we object to any attempt to relitigate matters already established. Ms. Chin's financial situation and custodial suitability have been thoroughly documented." Judge Hendricks held up a hand for silence. "Mr. Wells, what specifically are you addressing?" Wells opened his briefcase with deliberate ceremony and withdrew a thick folder bound with legal ribbon. "Your Honor, it appears that my client has been filing financial disclosures under her maiden name, as is her legal right. These documents may clarify certain misconceptions about her actual circumstances." The first document Wells presented was a single sheet of paper, but as Judge Hendricks read it, her eyebrows rose dramatically. The courtroom remained silent, but Maya could see Morrison shifting uneasily in his chair, clearly sensing that something fundamental had changed. "Mr. Wells," Judge Hendricks said slowly, "this appears to be a financial disclosure showing assets in excess of $2 billion. Are you suggesting this belongs to your client?" Wells nodded calmly. "That is correct, Your Honor. Ms. Chun is the sole heir to Chun Industries, a multinational corporation based in Shanghai with significant holdings in technology, real estate, and renewable energy. She has been managing her family's American investments while completing her graduate studies." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison's face went completely white as the implications hit him. Richard Sterling's mouth actually fell open, while Margaret looked as if she had been physically struck. David turned to stare at Maya for the first time since entering the courtroom, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning horror at what he had thrown away. "Your Honor," Morrison stammered, rising unsteadily to his feet, "we were not provided with this information during discovery." Wells smiled with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. "Mr. Morrison, your discovery request specifically asked for assets held in the name of Maya Sterling. My client has been Maya Chun throughout these proceedings, as indicated in all court filings. Her assets are held under her legal name and various family trusts established long before her marriage to your client. Maya felt Emma stir in her arms and looked down at her daughter with apparent nervousness, though internally she was watching the Sterling family's world collapse with deep satisfaction. Every moment of their shock and dismay was being recorded by court stenographers and would become part of the permanent legal record. Judge Hendricks was now examining additional documents that Wells had provided. Mr. Wells, these appear to be bank statements, investment portfolios, and corporate filings spanning several years. How long has your client maintained this level of wealth? Since she was 18, Your Honor, Wells replied matter-of-factly. Ms. Chun inherited her position in the family business when she reached majority age. She has been personally worth more than $1 billion for nearly a decade. Margaret Sterling made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a moan. The woman who had dismissed Maya as a gold-digging fortune hunter was slowly realizing that Maya could have purchased the entire Sterling family law firm as a casual weekend acquisition. Morrison attempted to recover some composure. Your Honor, regardless of any hidden assets, the issue of custody remains. Ms. Chun deliberately concealed her wealth during the marriage, which speaks to her character and honesty. Wells turned toward Morrison with an expression of mild interest. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that financial transparency should be a factor in custody determinations? Because I have some recordings you might find illuminating. The lawyer produced a small digital device and addressed the court. Your Honor, my client has been documenting interactions with the Sterling family since the night her daughter was born. With the court's permission, I would like to present evidence of their actual motivations and character. Judge Hendricks nodded grimly. Proceed, Mr. Wells. The first recording was from the hospital room, capturing Margaret's voice with crystal clarity as she dismissed Emma as a youthful mistake and threatened Maya with an expensive custody battle. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Margaret's words echoed off the walls, each cruel comment landing like a physical blow. They think Mommy is just a poor little foreign girl with no power and no options. Maya's own voice came through the speakers, addressing her newborn daughter. They have no idea what they've just started. Morrison was frantically scribbling notes, clearly trying to find some legal angle to challenge the recordings. Your Honor, these recordings were made without consent. They should be inadmissible. Wells consulted a legal brief. Actually, Mr. Morrison, recordings made by a party to the conversation are perfectly legal in this state. Your clients were not informed they were being recorded, but they were not legally entitled to that information. The recordings continued, documenting weeks of systematic cruelty and cultural prejudice. The courtroom heard Margaret dismiss Maya's Harvard MBA as a diversity admission. Richard threatened Maya with superior legal resources, and most damaging of all, David admitting to his parents that he had married Maya primarily for her family connections, never suspecting that those connections were worth billions rather than the modest business relationships he had imagined. Judge Hendricks stopped the playback after nearly an hour of devastating evidence. Mr. Morrison, does your client wish to respond to these recordings? Morrison looked toward the Sterling family table, where Richard was frantically whispering with David while Margaret sat in stunned silence. The confident family that had entered the courtroom now looked like survivors of some terrible accident, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of their miscalculation. Your Honor, Morrison said weakly, these recordings represent private conversations taken out of context. My client's family was simply trying to protect their son from what appeared to be a financially motivated marriage. Wells stood and approached the bench. Your Honor, I believe Mr. Morrison's last statement raises an interesting point about financially motivated marriages. Perhaps we should examine exactly who benefited financially from my client's relationship with David Sterling. The next set of documents Wells presented showed a detailed financial history of David's life during his marriage to Maya. The Sterling family watched in growing horror as Wells methodically proved that Maya had been supporting David entirely, paying for his apartment, his car, his clothes, and even his law school tuition through carefully disguised gifts and loans that David had never realized were coming from his wife's personal fortune. Mr. Sterling has been living off my client's wealth for over 2 years, Wells explained calmly. She paid for everything from his daily coffee to his interview suits. all while allowing him to believe he was the primary provider in their relationship. David looked as if he might be sick. The man who had accused Maya of being a gold digger had apparently been living as a kept man without realizing it, supported entirely by the woman he was now trying to destroy in court. Wells was not finished. He presented evidence that Maya had quietly established a trust fund for Emma worth $100 million, already funded and managed by a team of international financial advisors. The Sterling family's generous offer to provide for their granddaughter's future suddenly looked pathetically inadequate. Your Honor, Wells continued, my client has also established a college fund, a medical fund, and a trust that will provide Emma with financial independence for life. She has consulted with child development experts, pediatric nutritionists, and early childhood educators to ensure her daughter receives the best possible care. This hardly sounds like the behavior of an unfit mother. Morrison made one final desperate attempt to salvage his case. Your Honor, Ms. Chin's deception about her financial status raises serious questions about her honesty and fitness as a parent. She has been living a lie throughout this entire relationship. Wells smiled and opened another file. Mr. Morrison, let me address the question of deception by presenting evidence of your client's honesty during his marriage to my client. The next recordings were even more devastating. They captured David discussing his affairs during Maya's pregnancy, laughing with friends about how easy it was to manipulate his naive foreign wife, and worst of all, planning with his parents to divorce Maya immediately after Emma's birth to avoid paying child support for more than a few months. We can get custody based on financial instability, David's voice echoed through the courtroom. Then I won't have to pay anything significant, and I can start fresh with someone more suitable. The Sterling family was now completely silent, realizing that every private conversation, every cruel strategy session, and every moment of calculated cruelty had been captured and preserved. Maya had been building a legal case against them from the very beginning, documenting their behavior with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly how power worked and how to use it. Judge Hendricks removed her glasses and looked directly at the Sterling family. I have heard enough testimony to make some preliminary determinations. Ms. Chun will retain full custody of her daughter, with Mr. Sterling granted supervised visitation rights pending further evaluation. The court also awards Ms. Chun her legal fees and costs, which I suspect will be considerable given the caliber of representation she has secured. Morrison stood shakily. Your Honor, we request time to prepare an appeal. Wells rose smoothly. Your Honor, we would welcome an appeal. It will give us additional opportunities to present evidence of the Sterling family's behavior and motivations. We have several hours of additional recordings that we did not have time to present today. The threat of more recordings clearly terrified the Sterling family. Margaret looked as if she might faint, while Richard was frantically calculating the professional damage that additional exposure could cause to his law firm's reputation. As the court adjourned, Maya stood slowly, still holding Emma with apparent nervousness despite having just achieved complete victory. She looked toward the Sterling family table where David sat in devastated silence, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had lost. Emma stirred in her arms and opened her dark eyes, gazing around the courtroom with the calm curiosity of a baby who had no idea she had just inherited a fortune and gained protection from people who had planned to use her as leverage against her own mother. Maya whispered softly to her daughter, just loud enough for the Sterling family to hear as they prepared their humiliating retreat. Mommy told you they had no idea what they started, sweetheart. Now they're beginning to understand. Maya Chin rose from her chair with a composure that transformed the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. Gone was the nervous, hesitant woman who had appeared vulnerable and overwhelmed just moments before. In her place stood someone who commanded attention through sheer presence, holding Emma with the confident grace of a woman who had never doubted her ability to protect what mattered most. Your Honor, Maya said, her voice carrying a clarity and authority that made everyone in the courtroom sit straighter, I would like to address some additional matters that I believe are relevant to these proceedings. Judge Hendricks nodded, clearly recognizing the dramatic shift in Maya's demeanor. Please proceed, Ms. Chun. Maya adjusted Emma slightly and began speaking in measured tones that suggested years of experience addressing boardrooms and business negotiations. Your Honor, My attorney has presented evidence of my financial resources and the Sterling family's behavior toward me and my daughter. However, I believe the court should understand the full scope of what has transpired here. She turned slightly toward the Sterling family table, where Morrison sat in visible distress, while Richard and Margaret appeared to be in some form of shock. David had his head in his hands, apparently unable to process the complete reversal of everything he thought he understood about his life. I have known about David Sterling's family's financial difficulties for over 3 years, Your Honor. Sterling and Associates has been operating at a significant loss, with debts exceeding $4 million and facing potential bankruptcy within 6 months. Richard Sterling's head snapped up, his face draining of color. Maya's calm revelation of information that was supposedly confidential to his business partners was clearly devastating in ways that went far beyond the current custody case. Maya continued with ruthless precision. When David began courting me during our first year of law school, I commissioned a thorough background investigation of his family. I knew about their debts, their declining client base, and their desperate need for capital infusion. I also knew they were hoping my family connections might provide access to Chinese business opportunities. Judge Hendricks was listening with obvious fascination as Maya systematically dismantled every assumption the Sterling family had made about their relationship. What the Sterling family never realized, Your Honor, is that I was documenting our entire relationship from the beginning. Every conversation, every family dinner, every moment when they revealed their true motivations and character. Maya's attorney, Harrison Wells, approached the bench with another folder. Your Honor, my client has been consulting with family law attorneys since her engagement to David Sterling. She has been building a comprehensive case file for over 2 years, anticipating exactly this scenario. Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. Your Honor, this suggests premeditation and deception on an extraordinary scale. Maya turned toward Morrison with an expression of mild interest. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that it was deceptive for me to protect myself and my future daughter from people who openly discussed using her as leverage against me? Would you prefer that I had been naive and unprepared? She reached into her simple folder and withdrew a stack of documents that Wells had not yet presented. Your Honor, these are transcripts of conversations between David and his parents discussing their strategy for our marriage. They planned to use my pregnancy to pressure me into signing financial agreements that would give them access to my family's business connections. The next recording that filled the courtroom was even more damning than the previous ones. David's voice, recorded during Maya's second trimester, discussing with his parents how they could leverage her emotional attachment to the baby to gain control over her family's investment decisions. If we play this right, David could be heard saying, "We can position ourselves as intermediaries for any business deals her family wants to do in America. We just need to make sure she's completely dependent on us emotionally before the baby comes." Margaret Sterling made a soft whimpering sound as her own voice joined the conversation, suggesting ways to isolate Maya from any support systems and ensure her complete reliance on the Sterling family for guidance and assistance. Maya paused the recording and addressed the court with calm authority. Your Honor, I want to be clear about something. I love David Sterling, or at least I love the man I thought he was. I entered our marriage hoping that his family would eventually accept me and that we could build a genuine life together. Her voice carried just enough emotion to be believable without suggesting weakness. But I also understood that love without protection is simply vulnerability waiting to be exploited. So I protected myself and my daughter. Judge Hendricks was clearly struggling to process the complexity of what she was witnessing. Ms. Chun, you're saying that you anticipated this exact situation and prepared for it throughout your entire marriage. Not this exact situation, Your Honor. I hoped I was wrong about their motivations. But I prepared for the possibility that their treatment of me during our engagement was indicative of how they would behave if they ever felt they had sufficient power over me. Maya turned toward David, who was now looking at her with an expression of complete devastation. David, I gave you every opportunity to prove that you were different from your parents. Every conversation we had about respect, about partnership, about building something real together was a chance for you to show me who you really were. Her voice remained steady, but there was an unmistakable note of sadness beneath the strength. Instead, you chose to participate in their plans. You chose to view our daughter as a bargaining chip rather than a person deserving protection and love. David tried to speak, but no words emerged. The man who had accused Maya of trapping him was slowly realizing that he had trapped himself through his own choices and character. Wells presented another document to the court. Your Honor, Ms. Chun has also prepared evidence regarding Mr. Sterling's extramarital activities during her pregnancy. We have documentation of multiple affairs, including financial records showing payments to various women and hotel receipts covering the period when Ms. Chun was hospitalized for pregnancy complications. The revelation that David had been unfaithful during Maya's most vulnerable moments added another layer of cruelty to an already devastating case. Margaret Sterling closed her eyes as if in physical pain, apparently understanding that every detail of their family's behavior was being systematically exposed and preserved in legal records. Maya continued with relentless precision. Your Honor, I established Emma's trust fund not to show off my wealth, but because I realized early in my marriage that my daughter might need protection from her own father's family. Every dollar in that fund represents my determination to ensure that she never experiences the kind of manipulation and exploitation that they planned for both of us. She adjusted Emma in her arms, and for the first time since beginning her statement, her voice carried unmistakable steel. I will not allow my daughter to grow up in an environment where love is conditional on financial utility, where her worth is measured by what she can provide to adults who should be protecting her. Judge Hendricks removed her glasses and looked directly at the Sterling family. I have presided over many custody cases, but I have never encountered such systematic documentation of calculated emotional abuse. Ms. Chun, what exactly are you requesting from this court? Maya's response was swift and decisive. Full custody with no unsupervised visitation for David until he completes extensive counseling and demonstrates genuine change in his character and priorities. Complete prohibition of contact between my daughter and David's parents. And I am requesting that the court order the Sterling family to pay damages for the emotional distress they have caused through their deliberate campaign of psychological abuse. Morrison struggled to his feet one final time. Your Honor, these requests are excessive and punitive. My client made mistakes, but he is still Emma's father. Maya turned toward Morrison with an expression that could have frozen water. Mr. Morrison, your client participated in a plan to use his newborn daughter as leverage against her mother. He committed adultery during my pregnancy and then tried to claim I had trapped him. He sat silently while his parents subjected me to racist abuse and threatened to destroy me financially. Her voice rose slightly, carrying the full weight of controlled fury. What part of that behavior suggests he is ready to be trusted with an innocent child's well-being? The courtroom fell silent as Maya's words settled over everyone present. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing, apparently transfixed by the complete reversal of power that had taken place. David finally managed to speak, his voice broken and desperate. Maya, I'm sorry. I was weak, and I let them manipulate me. I never meant for things to go this far. Maya looked at him with something that might have been pity. David, you had months to be strong. You had months to choose your daughter over your parents' plans. You had months to choose love over manipulation. Instead, you chose to participate in their scheme to destroy the woman who loved you and the mother of your child. She turned back to Judge Hendricks with renewed composure. Your Honor, I am not interested in revenge. I am interested in justice, and I am committed to protecting my daughter from people who have demonstrated beyond any doubt that they view her as a tool rather than a person deserving of unconditional love and protection. As Maya returned to her seat, still holding Emma with the same protective grace she had shown throughout the proceedings, the Sterling family sat in complete silence. Their carefully constructed plans had not merely failed, they had been systematically dismantled by someone who had understood their motivations better than they understood them themselves. The woman they had dismissed as a vulnerable foreign girl had orchestrated their complete destruction while appearing to be their victim. Every cruel word, every manipulation, every moment of calculated abuse had been turned against them with devastating precision. Emma stirred in Maya's arms and made a soft sound, completely oblivious to the fact that her mother had just secured her future and delivered justice with the kind of strategic brilliance that would have made ancient generals proud. 6 months had passed since the courtroom devastation, and Maya Chen stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse nursery, watching the city spread out below like a promise of infinite possibility. Emma was napping peacefully in her custom-designed crib, surrounded by the soft afternoon light that filtered through the specially treated glass that protected them both from the world's intrusions while allowing them to see everything they chose to observe. The nursery was a masterpiece of understated luxury, with hand-painted murals depicting scenes from both Chinese and American folklore. Furniture crafted by artisans who understood that the best things were built to last for generations, and technology so advanced it was essentially invisible. Emma would grow up surrounded by beauty and security, but more importantly, she would grow up knowing she was unconditionally loved. Maya adjusted the silk scarf around her shoulders, a gift from her grandmother that she wore during important business calls, and picked up the tablet that displayed the morning's financial reports. Chen Industries had expanded its American operations significantly over the past months, acquiring 3 technology startups and establishing a renewable energy division that was already showing remarkable returns. The work kept Maya grounded and focused, reminding her that justice was only the beginning of building the kind of life she wanted for Emma. Every business decision she made was filtered through a single question. What kind of world did she want her daughter to inherit? From the apartment sound system, a news report played softly in the background, providing the kind of ambient information that successful people absorbed without conscious effort. Maya's attention sharpened when she heard a familiar name mentioned by the financial reporter. Sterling and Associates, once one of the city's most prestigious family law firms, has officially filed for bankruptcy following a series of high-profile client departures and ethics investigations. The firm's founding partners, Richard and Margaret Sterling, are reportedly facing personal financial ruin after several malpractice lawsuits and the revelation of irregularities in their business practices. Maya allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. She had not needed to actively pursue the Sterling family's destruction. Their own behavior and reputation had done the work for her. Once word spread through the legal community about their treatment of Maya and the recordings that had been presented in court, clients had begun leaving in droves. No one wanted to be represented by lawyers who had been exposed as cruel, prejudiced, and strategically incompetent. The news report continued with additional details that Maya found grimly satisfying. Richard Sterling had been forced to sell his house and most of his possessions to pay mounting legal fees and settlements. Margaret had apparently suffered some kind of nervous breakdown and was rumored to be living with distant relatives in another state, having been effectively ostracized by the social circles she had once dominated. Maya's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her security team. David was approaching the building for his scheduled supervised visit with Emma, accompanied by his court-appointed monitor and looking, according to the brief report, like a man who had aged several years in the past few months. The visits were awkward and painful affairs, with David clearly struggling to connect with the daughter he had once viewed as a strategic asset rather than a person deserving love. Emma, now 6 months old, was beginning to show signs of recognizing different people in her life, and her interactions with David were noticeably cooler than her responses to Maya or even the nannies and caretakers who helped with her daily care. Maya had initially felt some sympathy for David's obvious suffering, but her protective instincts regarding Emma were stronger than any residual compassion for the man who had betrayed them both. The supervised visits were a legal requirement, not an emotional choice, and Maya used them as opportunities to observe whether David was making genuine progress in understanding the magnitude of what he had done. Her assistant knocked softly and entered the nursery with a folder of documents that required Maya's signature. Among them were adoption papers for 3 families Maya was helping through the foundation she had established to support single mothers facing difficult custody battles. Each case reminded her of her own experience, though none of the other women had possessed her resources or ability to fight back so effectively. The foundation work was deeply personal for Maya, representing her commitment to ensuring that other women wouldn't face the kind of systematic abuse and manipulation she had endured. Every family she helped felt like a small victory against the kind of thinking that treated women and children as property to be controlled rather than people deserving protection and respect. As Maya signed the documents, She reflected on the irony that the Sterling family's cruelty had ultimately led to her creating something that would help hundreds of other families. Their attempt to destroy her had instead inspired her to build something larger and more meaningful than they could have imagined. Emma stirred in her crib and opened her dark eyes, focusing on Maya with the kind of complete trust that only babies possessed. Maya set aside her work and lifted her daughter, feeling the familiar surge of fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision since Emma's birth. The phone rang with an international call, and Maya answered in fluent Mandarin, discussing quarterly projections with her parents while Emma babbled contentedly in her arms. The conversation was efficient and warm, covering both business matters and personal updates about Emma's development and milestones. Maya's parents had been horrified when they learned about the Sterling family's treatment of their daughter and granddaughter, but they had also been impressed by Maya's strategic handling of the situation. Her father, in particular, had expressed pride in how Maya had documented everything and built an unassailable legal case, while appearing vulnerable and unprepared. After ending the call, Maya walked to her home office, which occupied an entire wall of the penthouse and provided workspace for managing both her personal investments and her foundation activities. Emma seemed to enjoy these business sessions, often falling asleep to the sound of Maya's voice discussing complex financial strategies or legal precedents. On Maya's desk sat a framed photograph from Emma's recent professional photo session, showing both mother and daughter in matching silk dresses that had been specially designed by Maya's favorite couturier. The image captured something essential about their relationship: Emma's complete security in Maya's arms and Maya's absolute commitment to protecting that security forever. Beside the photograph was a letter from Harvard Law School, inviting Maya to speak at their upcoming symposium on international business law. The invitation represented the kind of professional recognition that Maya had always known she would achieve, but it felt more meaningful now that she was building it while raising Emma and creating positive change through her foundation work. Maya's computer chimed with a message from her legal team, providing an update on the final settlements from the Sterling family case. All appeals had been exhausted, all damages had been paid, and all legal restrictions regarding contact with Emma had been made permanent. The case was officially closed, representing not just personal justice, but legal precedent that would protect other families facing similar situations. As the afternoon faded into evening, Maya prepared Emma for her bedtime routine, which included reading from a selection of books in both English and Mandarin. Emma seemed to prefer the rhythm of Chinese poetry, often becoming sleepy when Maya recited the verses her own grandmother had shared decades earlier. Tonight, Maya chose a particular poem about strength growing from adversity, about how the most beautiful flowers bloomed in the most challenging conditions. As she recited the familiar words, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and security. The Sterling family had intended to break Maya's spirit and steal her daughter. Instead, they had provided her with the motivation to build something extraordinary. Their cruelty had revealed Maya's strength, their greed had exposed their own weaknesses, and their prejudice had ultimately led to their complete downfall. As Emma drifted off to sleep, Maya held her close and whispered the words that had become their nightly ritual. "They thought your love made mommy weak, sweetheart. But it made me invincible." The city lights twinkled beyond the nursery windows, and Maya felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had protected what mattered most while creating something meaningful from pain and betrayal. Emma would grow up knowing she was cherished, knowing she was powerful, and knowing that sometimes the greatest victories came not from avoiding difficult battles, but from fighting them with wisdom, preparation, and unshakable love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, Maya simply held her daughter and marveled at how perfectly justice could be served when love provided the strategy and determination provided the strength to see it through to completion. What started with you watching from wherever you are in the world has turned into something so much more beautiful than revenge. Sometimes the most satisfying ending isn't about destroying your enemies, but about building something so wonderful that their cruelty becomes irrelevant. If you've made it this far in Maya and Emma's story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment resonated most with you? And have you ever had to protect someone you love from people who underestimated your strength? Share your stories in the comments below.